Before going forward today, I just want to remind anyone who doesn't know yet or hasn't participated that my 2024 viewer survey is open for all of May. It really does help me make creative and business decisions regarding this channel. With that out of the way, I'm Sam Aronow, and this is the recap video for the second half of the First World War, in which I talk about things I left out of the videos, correct mistakes I made in the videos, and answer questions from Gaon and Navi level patrons on Patreon. First up, two minor corrections. It's the Scheldt River, not the Scheldt, and Antonio Oliveira de Salazar was Prime Minister of Portugal, not President, which I'm very surprised I didn't catch before the video came out. Gaon level patron Almogs writes, in your Sfarad Reborn video, you mentioned some crypto-Jews kept practices originally meant to keep their Judaism hidden, thinking they were an authentic part of the religion. Could you give examples for such practices and their origins? So, I think you've conflated, and it has been a long time since this video came out, so it's understandable. Two different points that I made about Schwarz's research. The first is that the crypto-Jews of Belmonte had a tradition around avoiding any public display or acknowledgement of their Judaism, and after so many generations, simply came to assume that that was just an integral part of the religion, which is pretty self-explanatory. There isn't much more to it than that. The second point is that the pressures of maintaining the religion in secret resulted in changes to its practice. And this mostly, according to Schwarz's own research, which I linked to a JSTOR article in the footnotes for that video, mostly this boiled down to the fact that they didn't speak Hebrew, but a lot of their prayers still derived their meaning from Hebrew, resulting in a lot of misremembering or mistranslation. For example, Schwarz makes a big deal of the fact that a very common phrase among the Belmonte Jews, both in their prayers and in just regular conversation, is the 73 names of the Lord. So he asked his father, who was of course a linguist and historian in his own right, where this could have come from. And Issachar Schwarz brought up a medieval Kabbalist named Ezra de Toledo, who had since fallen into deep obscurity, who argued that the Tetragrammaton, the unpronounced name of God, add up to 72 in Hebrew numerals, and this got misremembered as 73, while the rest of the world basically forgot about it. Minor correction, I misplaced the Putilov factory on my map of St. Petersburg. It was actually way on the outskirts, beyond the scope of this map, and as you might expect, it was way bigger. Another minor correction, the February declaration in my video mentions equality twice. This was just a typo. Section 4 should be announcing the upcoming elections and who's eligible to vote in them. One thing I knew would be controversial going in was my characterization of Symon Petliura, who prior to the end of the Cold War was widely viewed in the Jewish world as the primary architect of the pogroms that took place during the Russian Civil War. And since I'm unlikely to come back to this topic in the future, I want to talk about it now. By virtue of being on the losing side of the war, Petliura and many other anti-Bolshevik leftists were embraced by hardline conservatives in the West as if they'd been a united front. Obviously, the UPR were not any kind of conservative or reactionary, they were just the wrong kind of socialists, which Soviet leaders historically viewed as just as bad, if not an even bigger threat, for their ability to highlight the hypocrisies inherent in the Soviet system, which we will get to, but not today. The Soviets being very conscious of their image in the wider world, Western coverage of the Soviet Union tended to devolve into opposing propaganda campaigns, with the ultimate effect that anti-Bolshevik leftists who were able to present real information about Stalinist atrocities were easily dismissed as propagandists. Again, I will get to that. We will all get to that. The culmination of this narrative confusion came in 1926 when Petliura was murdered in exile in Paris by Samuel Sholem Schwarzbard, a French Jewish World War I veteran who then volunteered for the Bolsheviks after the armistice. As I said in the video, Soviet propaganda worked overtime to frame Petliura as having a proactive role in the pogroms in order to provoke Jews on the Ukrainian side into defecting. This is clearly something Schwarzbard took to heart because he immediately surrendered himself for trial and acknowledged his own guilt. However, this was a period in which the French socialists were probably at their most dominant, even more so in Paris, and there was at least a fair bit of ideological, if not geopolitical, sympathy toward the Soviets at the time. Furthermore, Soviet historical records were almost entirely off-limits to Westerners, so Schwarzbard's trial relied mostly on hearsay and, for lack of a better term, vibes. But in so doing, it ended up becoming more of a trial of Petliura than of Schwarzbard, so despite admitting his own guilt, he was found not guilty. So basically, it's the consequence of decades of internalized Soviet propaganda, with no available information to contradict the narrative. Though interestingly, the loudest voices of anti-Ukrainianism in the Jewish world today are found in the Israeli religious far right, which goes to show that this is very much still an active controversy in mainstream culture, which, much like you often find with science, tends to lag about 20 years behind academia. And that's one of the many reasons I close the comments. This episode didn't have any corrections, but it did have a lot of omissions, mainly because of the specific source I used to write most of it. So most of what I said in this video was based on Ze'ev Jabotinsky's book, The Story of the Jewish Legion, which is in the public domain, but has also been out of print since its original release in 1945 and is thus a collector's item. Most sellers I saw online were trying to sell copies for $500. Miraculously, I found one for just $50, and I had the idea to republish it, but I didn't have the time. Anyway, because Jabotinsky was a central participant in the events he wrote about, he had a vested interest in highlighting or characterizing certain figures in a way that I, being an outside observer, wouldn't. This is also why I will probably never cover any historical events from my adult life, and this resulted in me cutting out two characters that he considered major and I didn't. The first was Leo Amery, who was a major in the British Army and a member of Parliament, and was the main go-between who first introduced Patterson and Jabotinsky to Herbert Samuel. And he doesn't really do much else, but he gets a lot of attention from Jabo, because I guess he just liked the guy. Something that's interesting about that, though, is that, and no one could have known this at the time, is that Amery's mother was a Jewish immigrant from Hungary, though Amery was, I believe, a practicing Christian, and this was, he seemed very ashamed of this because nobody knew about his mother in his lifetime, to the point that his son, John Amery, was a traitor who defected from Britain and joined the Nazis. The other person I left out was Henry Wickham Steed. Who would, after the war, briefly become editor of the Times and the biggest media cheerleader for the Jewish Legion from the British right, if only because the Jewish contingent of the Conservative Party was mostly anti-Zionist. But whereas Labour endorsed Zionism mostly out of idealism, and the Liberals did so in a mix of idealism and opportunism, the Conservatives were mostly just opportunistic, and none more so than Steed, whose Zionism was actively anti-Semitic. Jabotinsky in his book goes out of his way to dismiss the accusations of anti-Semitism, but he was writing this after the war, so it wasn't really plausibly deniable. I mean, Steed thought that Labour's initial opposition to the war was a Jewish plot. After the war, he was the first person to publish the Protocols of the Elders of Zion in English. Not Henry Ford, as it turns out, though he did retract it shortly after learning it was a forgery. So basically, Wickham Steed saw Zionism the way Boromir saw the One Ring. Frankly, the Zionist movement in Britain at this time was overwhelmingly a labor thing, which by the end of Jabotinsky's life was something he would have very much wanted to downplay, and I suspect that this was a major factor in his highlighting of Steed, but why that's the case really needs to be saved for another time. Another omission that kinda links into the 100 Days video, there were tanks on the Palestine Front, but only in single digits. Fighting in Palestine was very different from fighting on the Western Front. On both sides, the forces were much smaller. It was much more a matter of certain key positions rather than a continuous front. There was also a much greater use of the Navy and a much greater use of cavalry. And we today think of tanks as being perfect for the kind of open battle you'd expect in that kind of environment. But, and Monash faced the same problem, they just weren't fast enough yet. So at Gaza, they were just big, easy targets. While we're on the subject of tanks, it's come to my attention that French medium tanks were a lot faster than British Whippets, but I doubt Monash would have expected to have access to them for the 100 Days offensive. Frankly, French military procurement at this time was such a shit show that it's a miracle that any made it to the battlefield in their own sector. So for this one, I have a few corrections. First up, the first Jewish general in the modern era was not Heinrich von Zinge, but Henri Ruthenburg, who served in most of the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars starting in 1791, and was appointed as a brigadier by Napoleon in 1811. In another correction, I said in the video that Austria was motivated to continue the war in the renewed hope that the Central Powers might win, which is technically true, but at the same time, they didn't have a choice. This is called the Sixtus affair, and there are lots of good videos here on YouTube all about it. Basically, after making peace with the Soviets, Austrian Foreign Minister Count Czernin publicly attacked French Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau for obstructing a peace agreement. And in retaliation, Clemenceau publicized their secret negotiations and basically killed them because Germany had even less trust in Austria and far more leverage. And it was actually for his attempts to make peace that Emperor Karl was beatified by the Catholic Church, which is the level right below sainthood. Which is why in the comments you might have seen people saying, "Blessed Karl." Now, my biggest source for this video, specifically for anything I said about the military, I used Peter Applebaum's book Habsburg Sons, which is an excellent read, probably even better if you're not having to read it for work. And in that book, Applebaum lists Lithuanian as one of Austria's official languages, which I presented verbatim in my graphics. However, it appears that I was just reproducing a mistake that he made, because not only was Lithuanian not an official language of the Austrian Empire, I mean, why would it be? But Lithuanian, and I've pointed this out in previous videos, was never an official language of any country, not even Lithuania itself, until the establishment of the Lithuanian Republic at the end of this war. Apparently, I forgot to limit this Q&A to Gaon and Navi level patrons, but not catching that is 100% on me, so I will answer this question from Kibbutznik level patron Yevgenis Danilins. What do you think is the reason for the Mendelssohn line? What do you think of the phenomena of Baltic Jews who were east of the Mendelssohn line, but still very Germanized? The reasons for the Mendelssohn line are pretty obvious to me, and it's even implied in the name. It is reflective of the reality that in the Russian Empire and Galicia, Bukovina, Romania, most of the Balkans, the Haskalah never came to dominate Jewish society in those places, with further socio-political implications that unfolded through the 19th and early 20th centuries. And by the way, you can extend the line beyond this map. I would argue, for instance, that there's a second Mendelssohn line running through Asia. So things like the adoption of vernacular languages, the embrace of non-Haredi streams of Judaism, these were things that were the norm on one side of the line and the exception on the other side. The main explanations I would give were that these were more authoritarian societies in general, that the ideas of the Enlightenment and human rights generally were slower to arrive, not absent, but slower to arrive. And part of that is that the Enlightenment itself was a very Western European phenomenon, one that was almost certainly an outgrowth of the Protestant Reformation. And of course, the places west of the line were much more directly influenced by Napoleon. Another part of it, and this ties into the issue of Latvia, is that these were generally places where Jews were a much bigger percentage of the overall population, and where Jewish religious authorities held much more power and influence over their communities, whether officially or unofficially. Latvia, on the other hand, Courland, was always autonomous from the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, so it wasn't technically part of the Pale of Settlement, and it was also an area where the Jewish population was much smaller, and was also much more linguistically, culturally, religiously diverse than other parts of the Pale of Settlement. For example, Latvia had no majority church, and the largest church was Protestant, which obviously placed it under a much greater influence from the West. Also, because it was outside the Pale, and the Jewish community there was smaller, the influence of traditional Jewish institutions was much weaker, and Jewish subjects in Latvia had a lot more personal freedom in practice, if not necessarily in theory, than those in the Pale. You see a similar situation in other exceptional communities that are in the empire but outside of the Pale, like Georgia or Azerbaijan. But that's the thing. They are still exceptional, and thus they fit within the framework of the Mendelssohn line, which, to be fair, is descriptive. It's a thing I made up to explain the differences between East and West, and like any border like that, it's going to be pretty fuzzy, so I wouldn't take it too seriously. Would you believe that this video required the most reading I've ever had to do for a single video? It's true. It's not even close. So this question wasn't from a patron, and it doesn't have a concrete answer, but it was so common that I feel the need to address it, which is, why isn't Monash more famous? Where is his movie? Why don't we learn about him in school? That kind of thing. I did come across some dramatizations of Monash's story in my research, but they were all low-budget docudramas of a type I assume were produced at various times for Australian public television. I can't say the degree to which any one factor plays into his obscurity, but there are certainly a large number of them. The first is that, because the First World War is so totally overshadowed by the Second, figures of this period tend to fly under the radar in general. Add to that he was only a corps commander rather than an army commander, and you can see how he could slip through the cracks. Another knock-on effect is that, because the US entered the war so late, the narrative and popular culture around the war, at least in the English-speaking world, is almost monopolized by the British, who I've noticed tend to downplay Monash more than anyone, certainly more than the Americans, whom I'll note had a whole division serving under Monash from Amel all the way to the armistice. For the same reasons, the degrees to which the war absolutely devastated France, economically, demographically, more than all the other Western allies combined, is totally lost in English-speaking media, which is going to be super important when we talk about the degree to which their desire for revenge on Germany led to a lot of problems, not only in Europe after the war, but even in Palestine. Another thing I've found in my conversations with Australians is that Monash is very much celebrated there, but not very well understood. And this seems to be at the heart of Australia's bigger struggles to articulate their civic education. A lot of the research I did took me to articles and opinions that were very exasperated that Australia's history cannot be relevant to what are called New Australians, immigrants and the descendants of immigrants who immigrated to Australia after World War II, and broadly speaking, have no historical connections to Britain. This baffles me for two reasons. One, I'm American, and for all our educational faults, we are excellent at communicating to new immigrants why they should care about what happened before they got here. So far, I've made 3 videos about American history, which only barely ends with my family arriving there. Yet watching those videos, you can tell that the events before that clearly had an impact on me that wasn't just matter of fact. To the point that the American Revolution was the thing that first got me interested in history when I was a child. What's even more maddening about this is that Monash was kind of the ancestral New Australian. His family weren't convicts, they came because of the gold rush. His parents had no connections to the British Isles and didn't speak English as their first language. He was the first member of his family born in the country. He was a great patriot and a hard worker, and much of his own countrymen gave him shit for being the child of immigrants, but when the British gave him shit, it was for being Australian. I think there's no shortage of Australians who can relate to all of that. So with all Australia has in common with the US, it's weird to me that they're bad at this, which, on top of all the other biases in how we talk about World War I, tends to underplay him. And that's the recap. Be sure to fill out this year's viewer survey before the end of May if you haven't already. Coming up next should be my 50,000 subscriber Q&A, as well as a new regional special, and then we will enter the 1920s. As usual, special thanks to my patrons, including Mir Akbar Ali, Jeremy Biskin, Boris Cherny, FC, Matthew Feinberg, Jay Fleischman, Osha Gordon, Bob Huddy, Raphael Kellerman, Sol Cohn, Jacob Kossoff, Eric Liederman, and Jeffrey Schweitzer.